Case 1. John Ryhoff. A private laboratory in Texas extracted DNA from a piece of clothing that had been sitting in an evidence locker for 62 years. That single forensic action identified a perpetrator who had never once appeared in an investigative file, had never been interviewed, had never been named as a person of interest in 6 decades of inquiry. His name was John Ryhoff, and by the time science identified him, he had been dead for 51 years. On the afternoon of March 6, 1959, 9-year-old Candace Elaine Rogers, known to her family and neighbors as Candy, left her home on West Mission Avenue in Spokane, Washington. She was a member of the Bluebirds, the junior division of Campfire Girls of America, and she had set out to sell campfire mints in her neighborhood. She did not return home. Spokane police opened an investigation. Evidence was collected. Biological material was preserved from the scene, a decision made by the original investigators in 1959 that would prove consequential 62 years later. But in 1959, there was no national DNA database. There was no forensic genealogy. The biological evidence sat preserved, unanalyzed in any meaningful modern sense, while the investigation worked through every available method of the era. No perpetrator was identified. The case went cold. For more than 60 years, the Candy Rogers case remained open within the Spokane Police Department. Detectives who joined the force long after the crime learned about it during training. One suspect received significant investigative attention over the years: Hugh Byron Morse, a convicted killer known to have murdered at least 4 women, including 2 from Spokane. A detail in the original case materials had connected Morse to the inquiry, and investigators pursued that line for years. When Morse's DNA was eventually tested against the biological evidence from the Rogers case, it did not match. Morse was not responsible for Candy's death. He died in a Minnesota prison in 2003. The actual perpetrator had never appeared in a single report. In early 2021, Spokane police investigators working alongside Washington State Patrol crime lab experts were introduced to a forensic laboratory in Texas called Othram Incorporated. Othram specializes in forensic-grade genome sequencing, a process that builds a comprehensive DNA profile from severely degraded biological samples that older methods could not process. Investigators submitted the biological sample from Candy Rogers' clothing, preserved since 1959, to Othram for analysis. The resulting DNA profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database. The search narrowed the potential contributors to 3 brothers sharing a common paternal line: John Ryhoff, James Andrew Hoff, and Terry Allen Hoff. Of the 3, only John Ryhoff had living descendants, meaning only he could be confirmed through a paternity-based comparison with a living family member. On September 6, 2021, John Ryhoff's name entered the Spokane police case file for the first time in 62 years. Investigators contacted Hoff's daughter, Kathy. Upon learning the nature of the inquiry, she agreed to cooperate and voluntarily submitted a DNA sample. Washington State Patrol forensic scientist Brittany Wright analyzed the comparison. Her finding: the DNA from the Rogers crime scene was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy Hoff's DNA than to an unrelated member of the general population. That statistical result constituted strong evidence of paternity, meaning the biological material on Candy's clothing was linked to John Ryhoff. Because Hoff was deceased, he had died by suicide in 1970, there would be no criminal prosecution. Investigators determined they had an obligation to achieve the highest possible degree of scientific certainty before making any formal declaration. They applied for and received a search warrant authorizing the exhumation of John Ryhoff's remains. The exhumation was carried out on September 23, 2021. DNA was extracted directly from Hoff's remains and compared against the crime scene evidence. The result placed the statistical probability at 25 quintillion, 25 followed by 18 zeros, times more likely that the biological sample came from Hoff than from any unrelated individual in the general population. Who was John Ryhoff? He was born on August 11, 1938, and grew up on West College Avenue in Spokane, a short distance from Candy Rogers' home. He was 20 years old at the time of the crime and was serving in the United States Army, stationed at a Nike missile site protecting Fairchild Air Force Base. He had no prior record at the time of the crime. He was later discharged from the military in 1961 following a separate incident in which he was imprisoned for restraining a woman. He died in 1970 at the age of 31. He had never once appeared in connection with the Rogers investigation before the Othram genealogy database flagged his family line. On November 19, 2021, Spokane police held a press conference formally identifying John Rye Hoff as responsible for the death of 9-year-old Candy Rogers. The case was officially closed as resolved, 62 years after it began. Major Crimes Detective Zach Stormont described the case to reporters. It's the Mount Everest of our cold cases, the one that we could never seem to overcome. But at the same time, nobody ever forgot. Candy's surviving family members expressed gratitude to the investigative team. The case stands as one of the oldest cold case homicides ever resolved in Washington state history. Case 2. Robert Dwayne Washburn. More than 150 people voluntarily gave their DNA to detectives working this case. 149 of them were eliminated. The 150th, a man who had called in a tip to police months before the crime even occurred, was the match. On August 4, 1986, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian left her home in Tacoma and rode her bicycle into Point Defiance Park. Before leaving, she wrote a note for her family saying she would return by 6:30 that evening. Multiple witnesses reported seeing her in the park area as late as approximately 6 in the evening. She did not return by 6:30. She did not return at all. Tacoma police launched an investigation. Jennifer's remains were recovered approximately 3 weeks later in a wooded area off 5 Mile Drive within the park. Evidence indicated she had been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. No suspect was identified. The case went cold. At the same time, an investigation into the March 1986 death of 12-year-old Michelle Welch, killed in another North End Tacoma park under similar circumstances, was also underway. For years, investigators operated under the working assumption that both cases involved the same perpetrator. That theory shaped how both investigations were conducted for nearly 3 decades. In November of 2013, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory conducted an advanced analysis of Jennifer Bastian's swimsuit, the clothing she had been wearing the day she disappeared. The lab extracted a male DNA profile from the swimsuit. That profile did not match the male DNA profile from Michelle Welch's crime scene. 2 separate perpetrators. 2 separate cases. The assumption held for nearly 30 years was incorrect. With the DNA profiles now separated, Tacoma Police Detective Lindsay Wade was assigned to lead the renewed investigation into the Bastian case. Detective Wade engaged a forensic genealogist to conduct a Y chromosome analysis, a method that examines the paternal line of a genetic profile. The analysis produced several possible surnames associated with the unknown DNA contributor. Among them, Holbrook, Smith, and Washburn. Investigators worked through public records and law enforcement databases to identify individuals with each surname who had any potential connection to the case or to the area. One name stood out: Robert Washburn. Washburn was not on any prior suspect list. He had no criminal history at the time. But records showed that in May of 1986, months before Jennifer Bastian's death, Washburn had voluntarily called Tacoma police to report a suspicious individual he had seen in connection with the Michelle Welch investigation. He had been in contact with law enforcement during the period of both killings, and he had been living in Tacoma at the time. By 2017, Washburn had relocated to Eureka, Illinois. Between 2016 and 2017, Tacoma police and FBI agents undertook a systematic DNA collection effort. Every individual who could be connected, even remotely, to the Bastian investigation was contacted and asked to provide a voluntary sample. More than 150 people cooperated. Samples were submitted in groups of 20 to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Washburn was contacted in March of 2017 and voluntarily provided a DNA sample. His sample was placed in one of the final batches submitted for analysis. On May 7, 2018, 14 months after his sample was collected, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory confirmed the match. Robert Washburn's DNA was consistent with the evidence recovered from Jennifer's swimsuit in 1986. 3 days later, Washburn was arrested in Eureka, Illinois, with assistance from Illinois State Police and the Woodford County Sheriff's Office. He was extradited to Washington State and formally charged with first-degree murder on May 24, 2018. Washburn initially entered a not guilty plea. On January 25, 2019, he changed his plea to guilty before Snohomish County Superior Court. In a written statement, Washburn stated he was entering the plea in part to spare the family from a trial. Jennifer's sister, Teresa Bastian, addressed the court at sentencing. He did not come forward. He was caught by law enforcement. Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Martin sentenced Washburn to 320 months, 1 month, the judge noted, for every year the Bastian family had lived without resolution. The sentence required a minimum of 20 years before any eligibility for release consideration. Washburn is currently serving his sentence at Airway Heights Corrections Center in Washington State. In a parallel development, the Michelle Welch investigation, conducted entirely separately, was resolved in June 2018 when DNA linked that case to Gary Hartman, a 66-year-old Lakewood man who was charged and later convicted. 2 cases, 2 victims, 2 investigations, 2 different perpetrators, both resolved through DNA in the same year, 32 years after the crimes. Case 3. Lee Robert Miller. His name appeared on a slip of paper inside the victim's purse. It also appeared independently in a homicide case file in another state. For years, detectives in 2 states had no idea those 2 names were the same person. When they finally compared notes, it took 1 discarded cigarette to close both cases. On the night of September 8, 1992, 57-year-old Marilyn Hickey visited the Drift Inn Tavern near the ferry terminal in Bremerton, Washington, where she was a regular customer. That evening, a bartender observed her with a man described as being in his mid-20s with red hair. The bartender had seen the 2 together at the establishment before. In the early hours of September 9th, Hickey and the man left together by taxi. Marilyn Hickey was found deceased in her studio apartment shortly afterward. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Biological evidence was collected at the scene. A composite sketch of the man last seen with Hickey was developed from the bartender's description and released publicly. No arrest was made. The case went cold. In 2008, 16 years after the crime, Bremerton Police cold case detectives submitted the DNA evidence to CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System. The submission produced no match. The profile existed in the database as an unidentified contributor. Working through the original case materials, investigators found that among Hickey's personal belongings recovered from her apartment was a slip of paper inside her purse bearing a name, Lee Miller. At the time, there was no criminal history or identifying information that allowed investigators to confirm an identity or establish a clear connection to the crime. Hundreds of miles away, in Boise, Idaho, detectives investigating a separate 1994 homicide had independently compiled a suspect list that also included the name Lee Miller. In 2006, a forensic comparison between the biological evidence from Hickey's Bremerton case and DNA from the Idaho case confirmed that the same individual was responsible for both crimes. The profiles matched, but the identity behind that profile remained unknown. As the investigation progressed, detectives from the Bremerton Police Department and the Boise Police Department Violent Crimes Unit established a formal coordination channel, sharing investigative materials across state lines. The convergence of evidence, the name Lee Miller appearing independently in both case files, and the DNA link establishing both crimes as the work of the same person, allowed investigators to focus their efforts. By 2018, investigators had located a man named Lee Robert Miller living in Boise, Idaho. He was in his mid-50s. He had started a family. He was reportedly preparing to become a grandfather. There was no obvious indication to those around him that he was under any form of law enforcement scrutiny. Investigators needed a DNA sample to confirm he was the individual whose profile had been sitting unidentified in CODIS for a decade. They initiated surveillance. In February of 2018, while under surveillance in Boise, Miller discarded a cigarette butt. Investigators retrieved the item and submitted it to the crime laboratory for DNA extraction. The DNA profile extracted from the discarded cigarette matched the unidentified CODIS profile, the same profile connected to the Bremerton homicide in 1992 and the Idaho homicide in 1994. Lee Robert Miller was arrested on January 3, 2019. He was extradited to Washington State. Detective Martin Garland of the Bremerton Police Department explained the investigative breakthrough publicly. He wasn't a suspect in either one of our cases at the time, but because he was the only person that was in both of our case files, we identified him as likely the person responsible. Boise Police Sergeant Justin Kendall stated following the arrest, "This is a significant achievement for the Boise Police Department and the Bremerton Police Department, as we were able to use advancements in technology and coordinated investigative efforts to make strides in 2 decades-long investigations." On April 12, 2019, Lee Robert Miller entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder in the killing of Marilyn Hickey. He subsequently entered a second guilty plea in Idaho in connection with the 1994 homicide there. Miller had been a free man for more than 26 years. During that time, he had moved states, built a life, and was days away from becoming a grandfather. His name had appeared in a victim's purse in 1992. It had appeared in an Idaho investigative file in 1994. Both references had gone unconnected for years. It was a discarded cigarette that closed both cases. The investigation stands as a model of what cross-jurisdictional cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different states can accomplish, and of what patient, methodical comparison of case materials across years can produce. Case 4. Patrick Leon Nicholas. She arrived at her high school an hour early, alone, in the back parking lot. By the time her drill team boarded their bus, she was gone. For 31 years, no one was charged. Then a discarded cigarette, but outside a strip mall in Kent, Washington, matched DNA that had been waiting since 1991. On the morning of December 14, 1991, 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough drove her father's car to Federal Way High School. Sarah was a junior, an honors student, and a member of her school's drill team. The team was scheduled to depart for a competition in Kirkland. Sarah believed she was running late and arrived a little after 8 in the morning, approximately 1 hour before the team was due to gather. No one saw her leave her vehicle. When drill team members gathered and boarded their bus, Sarah was not present. By mid-morning, Sarah Yarborough's remains had been found near the back of the school campus. She was still in her drill team uniform. The cause of death was strangulation. Evidence indicated she had been sexually assaulted. King County investigators launched an extensive inquiry. Hundreds of individuals were interviewed. A composite sketch was developed and widely distributed. Tips were processed. No arrest was made. The case entered the cold case file, where it remained, reviewed periodically, never resolved, for nearly 3 decades. In 2011, in what forensic genealogy firm Identifinders International later documented as a landmark moment, investigators attempted for the first time in a documented cold case to use direct-to-consumer DNA test data to generate investigative intelligence from crime scene evidence. The Sarah Yarborough case is identified as the first known instance in which this approach was used. The attempt generated early intelligence but did not immediately identify a suspect. The science was still developing. The case continued. As the field of forensic genealogy advanced and public DNA databases expanded significantly in size through the mid-2010s, investigators returned to the Yarborough case with updated methodology. Working with forensic genealogists, King County cold case detectives built a genetic family tree from biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. Specifically, semen stains on Sarah's clothing and biological material found beneath her fingernails. That family tree construction eventually pointed to a man named Patrick Leon Nicholas, then living in Kent, Washington. Court records revealed that Nicholas had a prior conviction in 1983 for attempted first-degree rape in Benton County, Washington. That conviction predated the establishment of CODIs in the 1990s, meaning his DNA profile had never been entered into the national database. That gap had allowed him to avoid detection for years despite his prior criminal history. Prosecutors noted in their sentencing materials that in 4 prior documented attacks, Nicholas had approached women near their vehicles, used a weapon or threat to direct them towards secluded locations, and committed sexual assaults. That behavioral pattern aligned with the circumstances in which Sarah had last been seen, alone, in a parking lot, an hour before anyone was expected to arrive. To obtain a direct DNA sample from Nicholas without alerting him to the investigation, detectives placed him under surveillance. Nicholas was observed outside a dry cleaning business in Kent. He discarded a cigarette, butt. Investigators also recovered a napkin he had used and left behind. Both items were submitted to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. The DNA extracted from the cigarette butt and the napkin matched the biological evidence from Sarah Yarborough's clothing and from beneath her fingernails. The match was confirmed. Patrick Leon Nicholas was arrested in 2019, 28 years after the crime. He was charged with first-degree murder with sexual motivation. Nicholas entered a not guilty plea. The case proceeded to trial. Trial commenced on April 17, 2023, at the Norm Malling Regional Justice Center in Kent. The proceedings lasted approximately 2.5 weeks. Senior Deputy Prosecutor Mary Barbosa presented the DNA evidence chain in detail for the jury, documenting how the biological material from the crime scene matched the samples collected from Nicholas' discarded items. Defense attorney David Montez challenged the genealogical methodology used in the early phase of the investigation, noting that other potential suspects had been identified before Nicholas. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. On May 10, 2023, the jury found Patrick Leon Nicholas guilty of first-degree felony murder and second-degree murder. A special verdict determined the killing had been sexually motivated. On May 25, 2023, King County Superior Court Judge Josephine Wiggs sentenced Nicholas to 548 months, just over 45.5 years. The sexual motivation finding allowed the court to impose an exceptional sentence beyond the standard range. Sarah's mother, Laura Yarborough, addressed the court. Her brother, Andrew, who had been 11 years old when his sister was killed, also delivered a statement. A woman identified as Crony, a survivor of an earlier attack by Nicholas, came forward publicly to testify. Court records show Nicholas had been released from a prior prison sentence before completing the full term. Crony stated to the court that had the system functioned as designed at the time, Nicholas would still have been incarcerated in December of 1991. Nicholas did not address the court and has stated his intention to appeal his conviction. The Yarborough case is documented in the forensic genealogy record as the first cold case investigation in which direct-to-consumer DNA database information was used to generate investigative leads, a methodology that has since been used to resolve hundreds of cases across the United States. Case 5. Mitchell Gaff. 3 undercover detectives posed as market researchers conducting a survey on chewing gum flavors. They handed the subject a dish to discard his used gum. He threw it away. They took it to a laboratory. That piece of gum closed 2 murder cases that had been open for over 40 years. This is the most recent case in this documentary. It is also the case that involved the most complex chain of forensic procedures, and it ends with a 68-year-old man sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in Snohomish County Superior Court on May 13, 2026. Mitchell Gaff killed twice. Once in 1980, once in 1984. Both times in Everett, Washington. Both times in the homes of women he did not know. And for 46 years, he was never charged. On the night of July 11, 1980, 21-year-old Susan Vesey was at home in her apartment on Casino Road in Everett. It was her birthday. Her husband Ken worked the night shift. Their 2 young children, a 2-year-old daughter and an infant son, were in the apartment. When Ken Vesey returned home from work in the early hours of July 12, he found Susan deceased. Their children were unharmed. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Susan had been bound with drawstrings and electrical cords. Biological evidence was collected at the scene. No suspect was identified. The case went cold. 4 years later, on the night of June 1, 1984, 42-year-old Judith Weaver, known to those around her as Judy, returned to her apartment in Everett after finishing a shift at a local bar. She was a mother with 2 young children. Shortly after she arrived home, she was attacked. The cause of death was strangulation. Physical ligatures from the scene were collected as evidence. A fire subsequently broke out at the apartment. Everett Fire Department responded. Investigators determined the fire appeared to have been set in an attempt to destroy evidence. The 2 cases, Vesey in 1980 and Weaver in 1984, were investigated as separate, unrelated homicides. No suspect was identified in either. Both went cold. In 2020, Everett Police Department cold case investigators reopened the Judy Weaver file as part of a renewed departmental focus on unsolved homicides. Preserved evidence from the 1984 crime scene, specifically the ligatures used in the attack, was submitted to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for modern DNA analysis. Forensic scientist Lisa Knowlton conducted the analysis. Using advanced sequencing technology, Knowlton extracted a DNA profile from the ligature evidence. "I wasn't expecting anything to come from this, being the 80s, Knowlton later said publicly. "Not as many DNA precautions are taken. So I was expecting this to be some unknown profile from an EMT responder or something like that." In November of 2023, Knowlton submitted the DNA profile to CODIS for comparison against the National Convicted Offender Database. The system returned a match, Mitchell Gaff. Gaff was in the database as a result of a 1984 conviction for the rape of two teenage sisters in their Everett home, a crime committed fewer than 3 months after Judy Weaver's death. Gaff had also been civilly committed as a sexually violent predator. In separate civil proceedings in 1994 and 2000, juries had made that determination. Court records from those proceedings show Gaff admitted during testimony to assaulting numerous victims over the years. He had eventually been returned to community supervision. Investigators now had a CODIS match. Before making an arrest, they needed to independently confirm the match through a fresh biological sample taken directly from Gaff. In January of 2024, investigators designed and executed an undercover operation. 3 detectives approached Gaff posing as representatives of a market research company conducting consumer preference surveys on chewing gum flavors. Gaff was asked to sample several gum varieties as part of the survey. A dish was provided for participants to discard their chewed gum. Gaff participated. He discarded the gum. The detectives retrieved it. The DNA extracted from the gum was consistent with the biological evidence from Judy Weaver's crime scene. The CODIS match was confirmed through an independent sample. Gaff was arrested by the Everett Police Department in May of 2024 and charged with aggravated first-degree murder in connection with Weaver's death. Investigators then turned to the 1980 Susan Vesey case. The biological evidence preserved from the Vesey crime scene was tested against Gaff's confirmed DNA profile. The analysis established a connection between Gaff and the Vesey evidence as well. In March of 2025, prosecutors filed a second charge, aggravated first-degree murder, against Gaff in connection with Susan Vesey's death. On April 16, 2026, before a packed courtroom in Snohomish County Superior Court, Mitchell Gaff entered guilty pleas to both counts of first-degree murder. In entering the pleas, Gaff provided a factual account of each crime to the court. He described entering Susan Vesey's apartment through an unlocked door and hiding inside before she came to the bedroom. He described approaching Judy Weaver as she returned home from her work shift. On May 13, 2026, judge sentenced Gaff to a minimum of 50 years in prison with a maximum of life. Because the crimes occurred in the 1980s, before Washington state's determinate sentencing laws were fully in effect, the case fell under indeterminate sentencing guidelines, producing the range structure rather than a fixed term. The courtroom gallery was filled with family members of both victims. Several delivered impact statements before sentencing. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins, who had worked the modern analysis, spoke publicly about the technology that made the resolution possible, citing new software tools and the expansion of forensic genetic genealogy databases as the 2 primary advances that had unlocked the case. For closure to ultimately happen, prosecutors stated in their written materials, the Vesey and Weaver cases just needed science to catch up. Mitchell Gaff was 68 years old at sentencing. He had committed his first documented killing in 1980. He had remained free for 46 years. He is now serving a sentence that will keep him incarcerated for the remainder of his life. 3 undercover detectives, a market research cover story, and a piece of discarded chewing gum closed 2 homicides that 1980 forensic technology had no tools to solve. 5 cases. 5 perpetrators identified through forensic science and investigative persistence. Crimes committed across 6 decades, from 1959 through 1992, each investigated, shelved, and reopened. Each one resolved. The tools that resolve these cases, forensic-grade genome sequencing, genetic genealogy databases, CODIS, cross-jurisdictional DNA comparison, and controlled evidence collection operations, did not exist when most of these crimes were committed. The evidence, however, did exist. It had been preserved, and it waited. If this documentary helped you understand how cold case investigations work, the forensic procedures, the legal proceedings, and the technology involved, please leave a comment below. Tell us which case raised the most questions for you, or which forensic method you want to know more about. If you found value in this content, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more viewers who are interested in factual, in-depth true crime documentary content. And if you want to be notified when Cold Justice releases new episodes, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. Cold Justice covers only resolved cases where perpetrators have been identified, charged, or convicted. We cover the procedures. We cover the science. We cover the legal record. Because the evidence doesn't go anywhere. And neither do we.